I have spent my career watching how intelligence assessments are quietly bent to serve political comfort, but few moments illustrate the collapse of the American strategic narrative more clearly than the international reaction to the United States apprehending Nicolás Maduro. What should have been a straightforward discussion about accountability for an illegitimate ruler instead became an indictment of the institutions claiming to defend global order. The outrage from the United Nations was not rooted in facts on the ground in Venezuela, but in the disruption of a carefully managed narrative that had insulated failure for years. According to publicly reported statements and interviews, senior UN human rights officials expressed alarm that removing Maduro somehow made the world less safe, despite extensive documentation of political repression, election fraud, narcotics trafficking, and state violence under his rule. From an intelligence perspective, this reaction was revealing. Maduro was not a legitimate head of state, recognized by a large portion of the international community. Over 50 governments had already rejected the validity of his election, and multiple investigations had linked his inner circle to transnational criminal networks. None of this was secret intelligence. It was open source, documented by UN reports themselves, NGOs, court filings, and press investigations. Yet when decisive action occurred, the institutional reflex was not to reassess reality, but to defend the narrative infrastructure that had normalized paralysis. The strategic failure here was not operational, it was epistemological. Intelligence analysis is supposed to reduce uncertainty for decision makers. Instead, over time, intelligence related to Venezuela was filtered to avoid confronting the obvious. Sanctions were not dislodging the regime, diplomatic pressure was performative, and humanitarian suffering was being treated as an abstract talking point rather than a measurable consequence of policy failure. When the United States acted, the response from international bodies revealed how deeply invested they had become in preserving the appearance of process over the substance of outcomes. This moment mattered because it exposed a broader decay. Institutions that once claimed neutrality had internalized political incentives that punished action and rewarded procedural theater. Intelligence assessments that contradicted preferred narratives were sidelined, softened, or delayed. The result was a system that could document abuse endlessly but recoiled when confronted with accountability. From where I sit, this was not a surprise. It was the predictable outcome of decades in which intelligence became a tool for narrative maintenance rather than strategic clarity. The Maduro episode did not create this collapse. It merely stripped away the last illusion that the narrative still matched reality. I watched the intelligence profession change long before Venezuela became a headline, and by the time the Maduro crisis reached its peak, the transformation was complete. Intelligence was no longer primarily about assessing reality as it existed. It had become an exercise in narrative management designed to protect policy assumptions rather than test them. The Venezuela file was a textbook example. Analysts were not asked, is this strategy working? They were asked how to explain why it hadn't worked yet, and more importantly, how to frame that failure without forcing policymakers or international institutions to admit strategic error. This distortion did not happen overnight. It developed through a gradual but deliberate redefinition of what intelligence products were meant to do. Instead of blunt assessments that challenged power, intelligence estimates increasingly emphasized consensus language, probabilistic hedging, and ambiguity that could be selectively quoted. In the Venezuela case, sanctions were repeatedly described as increasing pressure, opposition movements were labeled gaining momentum, and regime collapse was treated as an inevitability just over the horizon. None of these claims were grounded in measurable indicators such as military loyalty, internal security cohesion, or economic control mechanisms. They were narrative placeholders. What made this especially corrosive was that contrary evidence was not absent, it was abundant. Open source reporting showed the Venezuelan security apparatus remained intact, that Russian and Cuban advisory support continued, and that sanctions were being adapted around through black market oil sales and illicit financial networks. Yet intelligence summaries downplayed these facts because acknowledging them would have forced a reassessment of the entire policy framework. Intelligence officers who raised uncomfortable conclusions learned quickly how those conclusions were received. Promotions favor alignment, not friction. The United Nations played a parallel role in this ecosystem. Its reports meticulously cataloged abuses while avoiding strategic implications. Human rights documentation became a substitute for action rather than a catalyst for it. When the United States finally apprehended Maduro, the institutional shock was not about legality or stability. It was about the collapse of a shared narrative that had allowed everyone involved to appear morally engaged while remaining strategically inert. From an intelligence standpoint, this was the inevitable endpoint of politicized analysis. Once intelligence becomes a supporting actor for predetermined outcomes, it ceases to function as intelligence at all. It becomes a script supervisor, ensuring continuity in the story even when the facts contradict the plot. The Maduro episode revealed how fragile that script had become. One decisive action exposed years of narrative padding, analytical evasions, and institutional self-protection. The hard lesson is that intelligence cannot coexist with self-deception for long without losing credibility. When analysts are trained to manage perceptions instead of interrogating reality, the system may remain stable on paper, but it collapses the moment reality intrudes. Venezuela was not an anomaly. It was a warning signal that the intelligence profession itself had drifted away from its foundational purpose. Venezuela did not become a strategic failure because the United States lacked information. It failed because decision makers refused to accept what that information consistently showed. From an intelligence standpoint, Venezuela was one of the most overanalyzed and understood cases of the last 2 decades. The data was there. The durability of authoritarian control, the adaptability of illicit finance networks, and the willingness of external actors to keep the regime afloat. What was missing was the institutional courage to admit that the prevailing strategy was built on fantasy rather than force. The core self-deception centered on regime change by attrition. Sanctions were treated as a precision instrument capable of collapsing political loyalty without triggering regime consolidation. Intelligence reporting repeatedly warned that this assumption ignored historical precedent. Sanctioned regimes rarely fracture from economic pain alone, they harden. In Venezuela, the security services became more dependent on the regime, not less. Food distribution, fuel access, and currency flows were centralized and weaponized. This was visible in real time. Yet intelligence summaries continued to frame economic collapse as a precursor to political collapse, rather than recognizing it as a mechanism of control. Another distortion involved the opposition narrative. Public messaging emphasized popular dissatisfaction as a proxy for imminent change. Intelligence professionals know better. Public discontent does not translate into regime vulnerability unless it penetrates the coercive apparatus. In Venezuela, it never did. The military leadership, intelligence services, and internal security forces remained intact, well-funded through illicit revenue streams, and shielded by external partners. These facts were acknowledged in technical annexes and classified cables, but they rarely made it into senior-level briefings where decisions were shaped. The United Nations contributed to this self-deception by treating documentation as strategy. Reports detailed torture, extrajudicial killings, and political imprisonment, all of which were real. But documentation without consequence became a form of institutional theater. When decisive action finally occurred, the outrage from UN officials was less about legal norms and more about the disruption of a process that had allowed failure to persist indefinitely. From my perspective, Venezuela illustrates how strategic self-deception becomes self-reinforcing. Intelligence that challenges assumptions is filtered out. Institutions reward narrative consistency over accuracy. Over time, policymakers begin to believe their own talking points. When reality intrudes, as it did with the apprehension of Maduro, the system reacts defensively, not analytically. The hard lesson is brutal but simple. Strategy built on wishful thinking does not fail quietly. It fails publicly, and it exposes everyone who participated in maintaining the illusion. Venezuela was not misunderstood. It was ignored deliberately. because acknowledging the truth would have required abandoning a narrative that had become politically and institutionally indispensable. The United Nations has long presented itself as the custodian of international legitimacy, but the Venezuela episode exposed how far that claim has drifted from operational reality. From an intelligence perspective, the UN's reaction to the apprehension of Nicolás Maduro was not principled alarm. It was institutional self-preservation. The outrage signaled that the organization's authority depended less on outcomes than on maintaining a process that insulated it from accountability. Moral authority, once separated from consequence, becomes performative. For years, UN bodies produced detailed reports documenting abuses in Venezuela. These reports were often accurate, methodologically sound, and corroborated by independent investigations. Yet they existed in a vacuum. Intelligence professionals understand that information without enforcement is not power. It is record keeping. The UN structure rewards documentation and consensus, not resolution. When confronted with an action that bypassed endless deliberation, the institution reacted as if its relevance had been threatened, because in many ways it had. What made the response especially revealing was the contradiction embedded within it. The same offices expressing alarm had previously acknowledged that Maduro's government engaged in systematic repression, election manipulation, and violent suppression of dissent. Those findings did not change. What changed was the loss of control over the narrative sequence. The UN had positioned itself as the arbiter of legitimacy, even as over 50 member states refused to recognize Maduro's mandate. This dissonance was never reconciled because reconciliation would have required admitting that legitimacy had already eroded beyond repair. Intelligence analysis teaches that institutions behave according to incentives. The UN's incentive structure prioritizes inclusivity over effectiveness and procedure over enforcement. This is not accidental. It allows the organization to survive geopolitical fractures by avoiding decisive alignment. But that survival strategy carries a cost. When real-world action occurs, the UN is forced into a reactive posture, defending abstract norms while appearing indifferent to tangible outcomes. The reaction to Maduro's capture followed this pattern precisely. From my vantage point, this is why claims of moral authority rang hollow. Authority is not derived from statements or resolutions. It is derived from the ability to shape behavior. In Venezuela, the UN shaped nothing. It documented suffering while the regime adapted, entrenched, and monetized repression. When action finally disrupted that equilibrium, the institution responded as though order had been violated, when in fact order had already collapsed. The hard lesson is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Institutions that confuse process with purpose eventually become obstacles to resolution. The UN did not fail Venezuela because it lacked information. It failed because it lacked the will and structural capacity to convert information into consequence. When that conversion happened outside its control, the illusion of moral authority was exposed for what it had become, a narrative shield for institutional inertia. What distinguished the apprehension of Nicolás Maduro from years of failed Venezuela policy was not legality, morality, or intelligence novelty. It was disruption. The Trump administration acted in a way that bypassed the consensus-driven paralysis that had defined U.S. and international engagement with Venezuela. From an intelligence perspective, this was not reckless improvisation. It was a recognition, implicit or explicit, that the existing framework had exhausted itself and that further adherence to it would only perpetuate strategic failure. For decades, U.S. foreign policy had trained itself to treat multilateral consensus as a prerequisite for legitimacy. Intelligence assessments were often shaped to reinforce this assumption, emphasizing risks of unilateral action while downplaying the costs of inaction. In the Venezuela case, those costs were measurable. Entrenchment of a criminalized state, regional destabilization, mass migration, and the normalization of authoritarian survival through illicit economies. These outcomes were not unforeseen. They were simply tolerated because confronting them would have required abandoning a comfortable narrative of pressure and engagement. The Trump approach inverted that logic. It treated action as a form of clarity. Intelligence professionals understand that decisive moves force adversaries and institutions alike to reveal their true positions. The reaction from the United Nations and from segments of the foreign policy establishment confirmed what years of analysis had suggested, that the system had become more invested in managing optics than resolving crises. The outrage was not about destabilization, it was about loss of narrative control. This disruption also exposed the fragility of deterrence by declaration. Sanctions, statements, and resolutions had been treated as substitutes for leverage. When actual leverage was applied, the contrast was stark. The world did not descend into chaos. Instead, institutions scrambled to explain why the outcome they had quietly deemed impossible had suddenly occurred. From an intelligence standpoint, this is a classic indicator of analytical failure. When reality surprises institutions that claim omniscience, it is usually because those institutions stop testing their assumptions. The Trump disruption did not solve Venezuela's problems overnight, and intelligence professionals should be wary of overcorrection. Action without strategy can be as dangerous as strategy without action. But what this episode demonstrated was that consensus had become an excuse rather than a constraint. Intelligence had been used to justify waiting rather than deciding. The hard lesson is that power, when applied decisively, clarifies reality faster than years of reports. Intelligence is supposed to prepare leaders for that reality, not protect them from it. By acting outside the consensus framework, the Trump administration unintentionally exposed how hollow that framework had become. In doing so, it revealed the extent to which American strategy had drifted from execution toward performance. The global reaction to the apprehension of Nicolás Maduro revealed a deeper problem than disagreement over tactics. It exposed how far American credibility had already eroded under the weight of its own narratives. From an intelligence standpoint, credibility is not a function of rhetoric. It is a function of consistency between stated objectives and observable behavior. For years, U.S. policy toward Venezuela and toward many other crises had communicated hesitation disguised as principle. When decisive action finally occurred, allies and adversaries alike were forced to reassess not just the event, but the long record of contradiction that preceded it. Allies who had privately acknowledged the futility of sanctions-only strategies reacted publicly with caution or silence. This was not confusion, it was reputational hedging. Intelligence services around the world had learned that American policy statements were often decoupled from follow-through. When that pattern breaks, even temporarily, it generates uncertainty. Some governments welcomed the clarity, others worried that unpredictability had replaced paralysis. Both reactions stemmed from the same source, years of narrative-driven policy that made U.S. intentions opaque even to partners. Adversaries drew sharper conclusions. They observed that American institutions could talk themselves into inaction for extended periods, then overcorrect suddenly under political pressure. This pattern undermines deterrence. Deterrence depends on adversaries believing that thresholds are known and enforced. Narrative management blurs those thresholds. Intelligence failures in this domain are subtle but damaging. They teach opponents that patience is rewarded and that outrage is often a substitute for response. The Venezuela case reinforced this lesson globally, even as it disrupted it locally. The United Nations reaction amplified this credibility gap. When an institution that claims to defend human rights appears more disturbed by the removal of an abusive leader than by his documented crimes, it signals incoherence. Intelligence analysts abroad do not miss these signals. They incorporate them into assessments of Western resolve and reliability. The result is a gradual rebalancing away from U.S.-led norms toward transactional, power-based calculations. This shift did not begin with Venezuela, but it was accelerated by the exposure of institutional contradictions. From my perspective, the most damaging consequence was not diplomatic friction, it was analytical drift. When credibility erodes, intelligence assessments become harder to anchor. Allies share less, adversaries test more, and assumptions harden in the absence of trust. The United States found itself in this position because it had spent years defending narratives that no longer aligned with outcomes. The hard lesson is that credibility cannot be restored through messaging campaigns or institutional reaffirmations. It is restored through repeated alignment of words and actions. Venezuela demonstrated how costly it is to let that alignment decay. By the time action finally occurred, the global system had already adjusted to American inconsistency. The disruption clarified reality, but it also revealed how much strategic ground had already been lost. There is nothing mysterious about how the American strategic narrative collapsed. Intelligence professionals have watched the process unfold for years, often powerless to stop it. The lesson exposed by the Maduro episode is not ideological, and it is not partisan. It is structural. When intelligence is subordinated to narrative convenience, strategy becomes performance, and performance eventually fails in public. The capture of Nicolás Maduro did not create a crisis of legitimacy. It revealed one that had already metastasized across institutions that mistook continuity for competence. At its core, the failure was a refusal to accept friction. Good intelligence creates friction. It disrupts assumptions, challenges timelines, and forces leaders to confront trade-offs they would rather avoid. What replaced that function was a system designed to smooth discomfort. Assessments were written to be defensible rather than accurate, cautious rather than clear. Over time, the distinction between uncertainty and evasion blurred. Decision makers were no longer informed by intelligence, they were insulated by it. The Venezuela case illustrates where that insulation leads. Sanctions were described as leverage long after evidence showed they had become background noise. Human rights reports accumulated without consequence, serving as moral documentation rather than strategic instruments. International institutions learned that expressing concern carried no cost, while decisive action carried reputational risk. Intelligence that should have forced recalibration was absorbed into a narrative loop that rewarded patience even as conditions deteriorated. When action finally broke that loop, the reaction was revealing. Institutions claimed shock not because the facts had changed, but because the script had. From an intelligence standpoint, this is the clearest indicator of systemic decay. When outcomes surprise institutions that possess the data to anticipate them, the problem is not information, it is will. The UN's response and the broader discomfort it exposed underscored how deeply invested the system had become in managing appearances rather than shaping reality. The hard lesson is one, intelligence officers learn early, but institutions forget easily. Power does not disappear because it is controversial. It disappears because it is deferred. Credibility does not erode from mistakes alone. It erodes from the refusal to correct them. The American strategic narrative collapsed because it prioritized coherence over correction and consensus over consequence. From where I stand, the path forward is not complicated, but it is uncomfortable. Intelligence must be restored to its adversarial role, not as opposition, but as discipline. Institutions must relearn that legitimacy follows effectiveness, not the other way around. The Maduro episode was not a triumph or a tragedy. It was a diagnostic. It showed in stark relief what happens when intelligence becomes fiction and narrative replaces strategy. The damage did not speak loudly, it spoke clearly.